Pathways to Prosperity Partnership and the Canadian Immigration Historical Society present Reflections from the Past.
Gerry Van Kessel, today we're going to talk about your role as you came into the position of Director General of Refugee Affairs, which you held between 1997 and 2001. And during that time you saw that the Refugee Affairs Division had changed considerably from the time when Mike Malloy was the first Director of Refugee Affairs. Tell me a little bit about how you happened to end up in this position, what was your background that brought you there, and what was Refugee Affairs like? Well, how big a shop was it when you took over, and in contrast to what we've heard before?
Okay. Well, it's I'd been with the department since 1973. And in fact, in 1972, I had a summer job at the High Commission in London, England. I joined in 1973, undertook a whole variety of jobs at headquarters, mostly in what we would call the admission field, family immigration, economic migration, temporary workers, students, visitors, but I never really touched on the enforcement side. I also dealt quite a bit with refugees. For a while I was chairman of an administrative body called the Special Review Committee, which looked at all refused Refugee Status Advisory Committee refusals to see if there were any criteria under which they would be allowed to remain. And I also worked in the area of budget, finance, and so on. And then for about 4 years after that, I went back to immigrants, visitors, and refugees. And then when the position of Director General of Refugees became vacant, I was asked to take the position. So that was in, I think it was May of 1997. So I'd had an extensive headquarters background as opposed to a field background when I took that position.
And how big was refugee group at that time?
Well, what's interesting is as I look back, and as I look back at what my predecessors had worked with, I think by this time the branch was a mature branch. It had 50 to 60 people. It had a division that dealt with asylum, had a division that dealt with resettlement, a division that dealt with international aspects of migration and refugees, and of course a support area. So 50 to 60 people compared to the 3 that one of my predecessors mentioned is a mature branch. Similarly, the issues that we dealt with, I think by this time had matured. Mm-hmm. It wasn't an issue any longer of whether or not we'd have a refugee determination system or whether we would have an asylum system. The issue was simply how do we make this achieve its objectives better, because as always there are problems. So those in large terms are what we faced. And also in my observations of my time, I'm influenced by the fact that after I left the position, I went to Geneva for 4 years, where I was coordinator of intergovernmental consultations, an intergovernmental body of about 16 normally states plus UNHCR and IOM and European Commission that were basically the rich countries that attracted asylum seekers, refugee claimants, and we'd set up an information exchange, both in terms of information generally about immigration and refugee procedures, data, statistics, and provided the opportunity for senior officials and subject matter experts at the working level to come together to share their knowledge, their problems, and to learn from each other. So I observed that, and so looking back, I'm no doubt influenced by what I learned about what is happening internationally, particularly in Europe and in Australia as well.
Well, when you started in Director General of Refugees, what was the environment at that time? C-55 had been in place. There was obviously quite a different environment. The problems of push-pull and the asylum system hadn't really been alleviated all that much. There were lots of things going on. So just describe what the environment was as you took over.
Well, when I arrived, the asylum system was facing the usual challenge. The usual challenge of how to ensure speedy decisions for people who needed protection and efficient processing of those people who were claiming refugee status for reasons having nothing to do with refugee protection whatsoever. But it was their way of saying, we want to live in your country. And that dilemma, that tension still existed in a major way. In the resettlement area, it was time to take a look at how to make the system work better to respond to some of the criticism that were being made by the NGO community. Just like previously, there were groups that were looking at immigration and refugees. And when I arrived, there was work underway by the Legislative Review Advisor Group, a group of 3.
And this was set up in the department.
This was set up in the department by a minister to take a look at immigration and refugees. And they took, so in terms of my area of responsibility, they took a look at refugee determination and at resettlement. At the same time, the Auditor General was taking a look at refugee determination, and a report came out in late '97, which basically complemented, shall we say, the observation of the Legislative Review Advisor Group, or the LRAG, as we called it. So when we got those reports in, we knew that further fixing of the system was required, and the minister came out with a white paper the following year in which we had sifted through everything, and there had been consultation, and we came out with recommendations on where we would go, both with respect to refugee determination and with respect to resettlement. And again, as I said, it was a fine-tuning. So for refugee determination, to a large extent, it had to do with the consolidation of the criteria that were being used to determine if there were refugee or humanitarian and compassionate grounds for letting someone stay. And as Raf Gerard has already mentioned, there was so much layering going on, layering not just of process and of procedures and of appeals, but also layering of decision-making itself. And so the decision was made that within the Immigration and Refugee Board, you would combine the refugee definition, the Convention Against Torture, some of the provisions of the ICCPR, which is a Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And so to combine that, so that rather than having decisions all at different points, and when to do humanitarian and compassionate, because sometimes there were grounds for allowing people to remain that had nothing to do with persecution or with oppression, but had to do with the humanitarian factors involved in individual circumstances of the individual. And the other thing that we had, and that we had great dilemma with, was, and the NGOs were sure to bring this to our attention, was since the process was so long, and if the circumstances of persecution, possible persecution, had changed in the home country between the start of the process and actual removal, when do you make a decision with respect to any changed circumstances? The challenge always is that the more steps that you added, the longer the time took for the process to be completed. The longer that the time took, the more attractive it became for people to make a claim, not because they had any serious grounds for persecution, because they wanted to stay permanently. And this culminated in an anecdote that I tell, at which, and this really happened, in my office we had a call from a person who in fairly heavily accented English said to one of my staff, I just want to know if it's true, the rumor that I've been hearing, that there's going to be an amnesty. Of course, what the person didn't know is, in fact, the minister had been thinking about that as a kind of a centennial present. It never came off. And my officer said, no, he says, haven't heard a thing about it. And the guy chuckles and he says, that's okay, he said, I can wait. So anticipation, expectation of the likely outcome of backlogs is built into the way people behave. And I think that's a very important to understand why there's always this tension. And for us, it was always a fact of trying to balance two imperatives. One, we are a signatory to the convention. We do not refool or remove people found to be refugees. We do not do that. At the same time, we are a sovereign state. We have the right to determine who shall join us, under what conditions, for what length of time, and so on. We have that right. So, UNHCR may say you should deal with refugees and migrants as migrants. And my answer always to the UNHCR was, that's not the issue. The issue is the asylum flows have both. And the question is, how do you separate those and reflect your accountabilities, your responsibilities towards both aspects? And that's the challenge. And that UNHCR and NGOs have great difficulty with and prefer not to deal with, because it involves messy choices.
Well, Gerry, we tend to talk a lot about the asylum side of the equation, and clearly when you were looking at new legislation, you were talking also about resettlement aspects of our business. Talk a little bit about how that was unfolding, and what were the issues there?
Well, the resettlement side has two aspects. The government selects, at that time, 7,300 refugees a year. We bring them to Canada, and we give them for a year a certain amount of money to survive, and so on. The second part is there are privately sponsored refugees. So Canadians can, through several mechanisms, bring to Canada a person we find to be a refugee overseas, bring them to Canada, and then they provide the assistance for 1 year. That's their obligation, and so the government doesn't have that obligation. The challenge for us was, when I arrived, was that when the LREG report came in, was that they were responding to complaints from the NGO community that we were not finding some of the people that groups in Canada were sponsoring, usually the relatives, to be refugees. And so we had to change the system. And their recommendation was, I thought, utterly bizarre. And that was that we should have abroad what we already had in Canada, namely the IRB, so that people abroad who applied as refugees would be seen by a member of the IRB with legal representation and with a right of appeal, and the NGOs would somehow be involved in that. And, we just couldn't believe it, because for the simple reason that who would want to replicate a system like the IRB abroad? Our reality abroad had always been fairly speedy processing, though not always as speedy as we would like, and working with UNHCR and with others to find and locate refugees, to help us to process them and to bring them to Canada. And it was the one part of the refugee program that everybody liked. All Canadians liked it. The department liked it because it was a very positive thing. We could help people out. And then when the white paper came, all that disappeared. And interestingly enough, I read a report by some of the NGOs who also felt that the LRAG recommendation really didn't make an awful lot of sense. And what we did instead was we revamped the entire way that we did resettlement. We looked at all aspects of it, and we streamlined it a lot. We brought in a few new programs like urgent protection cases to kind of formalize it more. If there was a case identified abroad that had to come to Canada quickly, then what we would do, we had an ability to bring that person to Canada very quickly, rather than as an exception to the normal process in which you go through the various steps and you wait until each step is completed before you get the visa. We also introduced a Women at Risk program to deal with women refugees who are particularly at risk. But then another example, if I may, of the classic immigration conundrum. We had a women's group in Nova Scotia who sponsored a case in South Africa of a woman who said that she was at risk. And so she was brought to Canada. She got to Canada, had barely been landed, that she sponsored her husband. And it became apparent that the whole thing was a scam. She had figured out that the way to get to Canada was through this program. Once she got here, she wanted to be with her husband, from whom she wasn't estranged, there was no difficulty or anything like that. And of course, the sponsoring group demanded that we remove that person from Canada. I chuckled and I said, forget it. I mean, this is the kind of reality we live all the time. Welcome to our world. So those are the kind of things that we were doing. It was a challenge when I arrived to get to 7,300 total, because the UNHCR wasn't referring enough cases to us.
We were looking at different parts of the world too.
Yes.
What was, usually there's a focus in terms of
Yes.
which countries we're resettling from. Where were we focused at that point?
Well, we were shifting at that time, in part because of the great difficulty that we had taking people out of Africa and so on. By the end of my time, that had changed again. But as I said to the Canadian Council for Refugees once, for the next 2 years, we're going to be taking more than usual Bosnians out of Europe, because they're cheap refugees. They're easy to find. They are refugees because the Germans were removing Bosnians back, but these were people in mixed marriages and so on that we felt would face real difficulties if they were sent back. So we took them. And we had people from Africa, from Asia. We would take people out of the camps in northern Pakistan and so on. And some from Latin America. As part of our planning process, what we would do each year, working with the Foreign Service, we would say, okay, how do we achieve the 7,300? Where will we assign the numbers to different missions to add up to the 7,300? And then halfway during the year, we'd see what adjustments will we make. Because if you assign, say, 50 to a post in Africa or 50 to a post in Europe, clearly the more efficient post is going to be in Europe. If in Africa, you know, if you're in Nairobi and you have to go to a refugee camp near Somalia, you know, that's a far more difficult thing to do. Things like identity are much more difficult to establish. Health is a bigger issue, and so on.
And what was the basis for decisions around the number? Was it based on a political decision? Was it based on our capacity for processing? Was it based on discussions that we had with communities? How did we come to the number of, say, 7,300?
The number 7,300 was driven by something completely different, budget. Each government-selected refugee needed so much money per year, for a year. How much money did we have? That divided by how much each refugee needed determined how many refugees would be selected. And I'm probably wrong on the number, but I think it was something like 50 to 54 million in that area that we had. And so that's the way that we determined the number. After my departure, and sometime after, there was an increase in the amount of government-sponsored refugees. And while I don't know this for a fact, to me it's logical that that was accompanied with an increased level of resources to fund the resettlement of that number over a period of time.
So the work that was being done, looking at the asylum process, the resettlement process, fed in by the LRAG paper and by the Auditor General,
Right.
that led you to a legislative, the beginning of a long legislative process,
That's right.
which you must have been quite involved in.
Yeah, I was very involved in that process, and when I left in the summer of 2001, that process was still underway. And that process was then influenced, not because, well, a little bit because of the asylum issues, by 9/11. Because I was due to leave for my new job on 9/11, so I didn't leave on 9/11. But that was a watershed in many ways, and it also led to a re-examination of some of the provisions of the legislation that had been put forward, and it brought back Safe Third, with the U.S. But it was really well underway. We'd had hearings before the standing committee. We made our proposals in terms of, the government made its proposal in terms of what it felt needed to be done.
So what were the, as you were leaving then, even before 9/11,
Right.
which obviously was a significant bellwether in terms of how we looked at policy, but what were the significant shifts then from where we were before, just
Okay.
briefly?
In terms of my areas of responsibility with resettlement, they were, I think, principally that the government was proposed that protection be the predominant factor in determining whether someone is resettled. We before had a balance between the need for protection as a refugee and the prospects for resettlement. And while we had no formal process to determine that, if we believe that the person could not successfully resettle, that person could be refused unless there was special help available. So that became important. The other one was doing away with the medical inadmissibility. It had been the case that if you were medically inadmissible, you could not come forward as a resettled refugee except under special provisions. So that was abandoned. And that would have been the minister's decision, much to the chagrin of the provinces, of course, pick up the tab. We also promised, but that's easy to do, to work more closely with UNHCR and agencies abroad and so on in finding refugees and so on. So that was on the resettlement front. On the asylum front is the consolidation of decision making. We did not go for the appeal because simply because the minister was concerned that whatever good could come out of an appeal would be more than counterbalanced by the bad that would happen if you simply added another step in the process for those people to delay their departure for a longer period again. We consolidated the criteria in the IRB that introduced not just the Geneva Convention definition of refugee, but also the Convention Against Torture, and also the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR mentioned earlier, so that we wouldn't have a separate process. There were some people who felt that this was opening the definition up too much. My feeling was that with a lot of these criteria in definitions, they are vague at best to start with. Because how else can a country like Canada find 90% of Tamils to be refugees at one time, and a country like the UK or Switzerland find 3% or 5%? It's the same definition. So, this definition you can stretch depending on your legal precedents and depending and the predilections of the decision makers and so on, and just the history of the country, how it looks at these issues. From my feeling, with the high approval rate that Canada historically has had, I figured that they were actually already taking those things into account when they were doing that. And the other thing that we brought in was the pre-removal risk assessment. And again, that's an attempt to codify in some kind of way the process whereby we determine if between the time of the negative decision and actual time of removal there have been changed circumstances. Ironically, we originally believed, I remember Ralph Gerard telling us that he wanted initially a decision made at the end of the process because that's where it made most sense. What we failed to understand at that time was that the process would be so time-consuming that months and years could elapse between the start and the finish of the process.
Yeah. And the pre-removal risk assessment was, it was a pretty big discussion in the department, but it was to be done in department. It was not, not an independent decision.
That's right. And the concern was that the belief was that if we had it under our control, that we could determine the time frame better. We were quite bluntly nervous that if we went to the IRB, that it would suffer the same delays that the initial hearing was already suffering from at the IRB. And that was a bit of a fight because there is a logic to do it the other way. That's where the expertise of the decision maker lies. But this is not just about the process of determining who's a refugee. This is also about a process for determining as quickly as you can who is not a refugee. And you have to balance both things.
Gerry, during all this time, as always, there's lots of other things happening, and also you had shifting political masters during this time.
Right.
How did the working with ministers influence this policy-making decision? Because you started off with, I believe, Madame Robillard, who was then the minister, and then it shifted.
Yes. Well, I had two ministers in my 4 years there. There was Madame Robillard, and then there was Madame Kaplan. Madame Robillard was wonderful to work with as a civil servant. She read everything you could send to her, constant complaint that you weren't sending her enough. And how do I know that she read everything? I came in one day, and we were looking at a cabinet document, and she turns to me, and she said, I want you to go to page 38 of the French version. That word is misspelled. And she looked at me as if to say, gotcha, don't you forget it. And it was done very, very nicely, because I had tremendous time for her. She was really wonderful, wonderful to deal with. But she had this tremendous sense of what I do can have tremendous impact on the future of this file, positively or negatively. I want it to be positive. So I will not do something merely because there are NGOs and pressure groups out there that want me to do that. She said, I could not, as I said earlier, I could not forgive myself if the appeal became just another delay. And there's an argument in its favor. For example, if we have such a high approval rate, really, what is an appeal going to do? Sure, in the odd case, but in an overall process sense. Then, and then she left for another portfolio, and Madame Kaplan came in. Madame Kaplan was much more tuned in to the NGOs, to the voluntary sector. And while she started out, very much saying we want to make those changes and so on, as she started to understand the pressure that these groups could bring, she backed away. She backed away more and more. At the human level, at the personal level, both these ministers were very, very, very good to work with. They were always, I felt, respectful. So it was.
There were changes, policy changes that were made in what had been
Yes.
decided with one minister
Yeah.
by the second. So,
That's right.
So that happens.
Yes, right. And that happens. And it's not the end of the world. It's just you make a call. But for example, the question of protection over settlement prospects and the medical inadmissibility as it affects refugees, but also spouses, if I recall correctly. That was Kaplan's decision. So yeah. So in brief terms, that's what it was. And we saw these ministers frequently because there was always cabinet documents under consideration or some issue that we needed to have an exchange on and so on. And so, yeah.
The sort of issue that, in a sense, put the spotlight on immigration again, even though we had all this legislative thinking going on, was to some extent the cost of our movement, which
Right.
was a very different movement
Right.
from some of the movements that we've had
Right.
in the past. Now, you and I were both involved in that. Talk about why that was different and what impact that movement had.
Well, what impact it had, and I'll go back to more specifics in a few minutes, but one element that was really important for the department as a department was it made the department feel good about itself again. We had been through a period of downsizing, really tough, closing of offices, particularly in the field. It's really, really tough. People were down. Our Christmas party, which used to be kind of the social highlight of the year, was really, it just no longer was. The department was down. Then, along comes Kosovo. And we did it, and we did it well, really well. And spirits just went sky high. And I recall a visit to one of the army bases where the Kosovars came in, and I was shown around by the manager. And when I left, didn't walk to his office, and this was at 7:30 at night. He ran, and I think that's what that did to the department.
So just talk, it was 1999,
Yeah.
and there were Kosovars who were from former Yugoslavia.
Yes.
And there was a problem, and we responded to the UNHCR, was it, that was
Yes.
asking us?
Yeah.
And initially, we didn't think that it was going to be a resettlement
Yeah.
issue.
This is one of those. Well, as you recall, what happened was the Kosovars were in conflict with the Yugoslav authorities. The Yugoslav authorities were making life very difficult for the Kosovars. The Kosovars started to leave Kosovo to Albania and to Macedonia. So, and all this was being done in the glare of kind of modern media. The feeling of countries and of UNHCR was that this is a classic country of first asylum case. You go to the country that you can, and you wait things out, and you get temporary protection.
Yeah.
That's right. So, and when we were approached about how we saw this issue, we all said that this was the way it should go. If we needed to assist Macedonia and Albania, we should do so, because we could understand that. We could also understand, in the case of Macedonia, that a lot of Kosovar Albanians coming in could upset the ethnic balance of that country, and so on. So we were sensitive to that. What we did not feel, and I think UNHCR at that time was in agreement, was that this was that the country of first asylum burden should be shared farther afield, and so on. And I recall a meeting of the 4 countries when we were in San Francisco. I think you were there as well, and we all agreed that this didn't make any sense. And Madame Ogata, the High Commissioner for Refugees, agreed as well. Well, then a few weeks later we got back, and I remember I was sitting at home, it was Holy Saturday. In the evening I got a phone call from Madame Robillard. She had just returned from China. She was very tired.
She returned in a hurry from China, yes.
And she was faced with this question of the Kosovars. And she said, I don't think we should take them. what do you think? I says, I don't think we should take them either. This is not a resettlement situation. This is what, we should help the people there. Our money is going to go infinitely further in Albania and Macedonia, and that's what we should do. And then she says, okay. She said, we'll talk again soon. I got to talk to the Prime Minister. 2 hours later, I get a phone call from Robiard's executive assistant saying, well, the Prime Minister talked to the President, we're taking 5,000. So I knew immediately that the kind of issues that we were addressing and concerned about were not issues that were being dealt with at the level of the Prime Minister and the President. And there the issues were high-level political issues, geopolitical issues, and so on. And my own personal belief is the CNN effect. It's that simply the political powers, both in Europe and in the U.S., did not like what they were seeing, and the fact that the exodus could be attributed to the bombing of Yugoslavia, so on. And the Europeans, always sensitive to people leaving, refugees leaving by train. They still don't use the word deportation because of that obvious historical sensitivity. And so we ended up at 5,000. And the next day we met at Foreign Affairs, Easter Sunday, and the deputy turned to me and says, well, you're going to be the person, your branch will be the center of operations at headquarters. And that's how it all started. And I appointed my director for resettlement, responsible for that. And so that meant for the next 6 to 8 weeks, in addition to legislation and so on, we knew what else we had to occupy our time.
But this was not intended to be a long-term resettlement
No.
either. So the intention from the outset was that these people would come for a period of time and then could most likely return.
Yeah. And I remember meeting with Minister Robiard and talking to her about this and saying, look, what we have here is a situation that we are offering temporary protection. We are a country of first asylum, even though we're an ocean away. And when you realize even the Australians were doing this. But the Australians had made clear, as had all other countries, that this was temporary. When this was over, you were going home. I says, look, do we want to get into that and all the issues associated with that, forcing people to return? She says, no. And I said, thank you, because I could just see how it could go, because we just don't have a history of that here. So we designed everything so that they could come here, get help from the sponsors who were all over the place. Everybody wanted a Kosovo refugee in their basement and so on. It was all done with the best of intentions, but we had to manage this and make sure, and make sure that this was done in an organized, structured manner, and that proper concern was taken for the facilities that were being offered and so on, so that people's generosity didn't overcome their good sense. Yeah. But I think it was about 3 weeks after the program was announced, the first plane arrived, and it was incredible. And then the plane arrives, huge press attention. Was the Prime Minister there? I think so. He was playing basketball. That's right. He was playing basketball, and one of the first people off the plane was dressed in real Western dress. And a nice little kid comes running up, and these are people who are afraid of authority, running up to embrace a policeman, and so on was standing there, and so on. And I says, how did public affairs manage this? The first people off the plane are yuppies from Albania. They look so good, and so that's the way the program ran. And we kept them in camps for a while because we did there was a little bit of triage work done in Macedonia and in Albania. And, we'll look you over. Oh, you look healthy. Okay, come to Canada. Oh, you don't look so good? Put you aside for a minute. So, stuff was done in Canada. And that went against the grain of medical.
Yeah, this is very unusual.
Because, they're quite tough on protecting health. The security people, this was a dangerous part of the world. The security people, They were all here. They arrived very, very quick, and it was all managed.
But I mean, I guess the significance of that movement was really that the intent was that we would take them temporarily, and that was an unusual situation.
Yeah.
So, as it turned out, did most of them go back, or?
No, I think about half of them, ended up staying.
Yeah.
There was an irony in that by the time that the crisis was over, people wanted to go back. We were waiting for the okay from UNHCR. UNHCR didn't want to give the okay until all landmines had been cleared. Meantime, all the, 750,000, 800,000 people in Albania and in Macedonia had rushed back. We were getting threats of hunger strikes from people who wanted to go back, of course knowing that we would pay for it, but wanted to go back, and we weren't saying no. And this was an example of the UNHCR being, quite frankly, out of touch with the reality on the ground and having that headquarters syndrome of all the policy issues have to be neatly in place before we can do all this kind of stuff. And so,
well, sort of, breaking your teeth on, or cutting your teeth on the Kosovo movement, then the next big thing that happened also in 1999 was the arrival of the first of the Chinese boats on the coast of Vancouver.
right.
And that had a pretty different feel in a way, didn't it, that movement?
Yeah, very, very different, Martha. In fact, all the goodwill that we had generated with the Kosovars was dissipated in a week because of the arrival of the boats. And boats, again, had that curious impact of incredible media attention and people just simply not accepting that this was an appropriate way to get to Canada and to make your case. And I think for a while, the temperature was highest, at its hottest, in British Columbia. And our Director General there, Chris Taylor, I think was probably the most disliked man in British Columbia, because he had to stand up and defend the process when the process was something that people just didn't buy, the public just didn't buy.
Well, and it was interesting because if you look at all the policy antecedents that lead up to this very public enactment of how we are in fact going to put our policies into place and be scrutinized by the legal fraternity,
right.
by the media, by all of the advocacy groups, and it was a pretty tense time trying to make sure we were doing the right thing.
And because it had so much media attention, we at headquarters would meet daily. You'll recall
Yes.
very well. We meet daily, and we got involved in levels of process that we normally would never get involved with, because every step was scrutinized. How long did we have the right to keep someone away from a lawyer? Because until they were examined, the lawyer has no right to be at the examination. And so we were scrutinized every step of the way. We were not forced to recognize, we knew this. But when the first boat had arrived, and we did what we normally do, which is we start the process and we release people, and they joined the other 80% of Chinese refugee claimants who disappeared, who abandoned their claims, because where they're really going is New York, or point south. And then we had to make the decision that we will detain when the second boat came. We will detain. And we maintained that detention. And the interesting thing for me is how successful we were, in fact, in limiting the quote-unquote damage, because the other boats were already underway. And there probably was a fifth boat that we never detected. But the other boats were already underway. We detained the people. So what we did by detaining the people and maintaining that detention throughout the process was to deny them what they really wanted, which was access to the labor market so they could start paying off the 50 to 60,000 US. They paid the smugglers to take the boat to come to Canada. And I think it really worked, but it was exceedingly difficult, and it demanded all of our attention for a considerable period of time. I too was on a holiday when the first boat went, and I heard it on the radio and says, because I also lived through the previous boat on the East Coast.
So, did that, if you look at it from the point of view again of how we manage refugee movements, how we manage refugee programs and refugee policy, did that took so much energy. Did it have a huge policy impact in the end? Did we ever go back and sort of analyze from a policy perspective how we handled that, and did we do things in the right way, or?
I don't think there was time, as always, there was so little time. I don't think we really analyzed what happened, what we could learn from that. But what we learned from that is detention works. And every time you discuss detention internally with the Treasury Board, the issue was cost. My belief always about detention was the upfront costs are huge, but the deterrent impact is much greater. Because at the end, what are people's objectives? The Chinese asylum seekers wanted to get access to the labor market. That's what it was all about. It was not about classic protection. It was of access to the labor market. By detaining them, you were denying them access. So therefore, making a refugee claim was not the way to go. And let me give you another example from another country. The U.S., during in the middle years of the Clinton presidency, changed the rules around work and asylum. What they said was, before they'd said, once you arrive, you indicate you're going to make a claim, we allow you to work. What they did was, they denied the right to work for the first 6 months. And what happened? The people who came to work knew making a refugee claim didn't make any sense, because they would deny you the right to work. So what's the point of a refugee claim? Don't make it, and just start working illegally. Not that that's so difficult. And what happened was, it cleaned the system out of a lot of people who were making claims for reasons having nothing to do with refugee protection, but having everything to do with their desire to find work, to make some money. And so what we saw was a tremendous, almost doubling in the approval rate that the Americans had for refugees, because it cleaned out the system. It was Rafis talked about access controls as an attempt to determine who gets into the system. This is one way, even if they're here, of determining they don't get into the system, at least muck that up. By doing that, So, but I think you have great difficulty convincing people who don't understand immigration that if you're talking about spending, say, $30 million on detention this year, that 2 years from now it'll be $5 million. Because they see it as an ongoing cost. They won't see it as a deterrent. And as Treasury Board met me once, was complaining about all the costs, and I was putting forward a proposal. And I said, look, let's get one thing straight. Pay me, you will. Whether it's now or it's later, you're going to pay. Because this is what it's going to cost. The only question is, when does it make most sense to spend the money? What is strategically and tactically the best way of spending the money? And they, of course, wanted, because they could never understand why we always had this problem. Every time they'd meet us, they'd be scratching their heads and saying, why are you guys here? And you'd explain it to them, but it wouldn't penetrate. Because it doesn't penetrate unless you live it for a long period of time.
Gerry, talk to me a bit about the boat phenomena, Chinese boat people phenomena, and our discussions with other countries at that time. Australia was having boats. Were you involved in a lot of discussions as this was ongoing with your Australian counterparts or your American counterparts? Because clearly America was concerned if we could get boats, they could get boats. What was that discussion like?
I personally didn't have that many discussions, because most of those discussions took place on the enforcement side, because it was seen more as an enforcement issue. So the question becomes, if it's an enforcement issue, but how do you deal with the protection issue within that larger enforcement issue? And the Americans would have a policy of dealing with it on the boat, of the when they would intercept people coming from particularly from Haiti and so on. The Australians, and that was in about the same time, the Australians were having a large number of boat arrivals as well. And for the Australians, the difference was that they wanted to stop them getting to the country. Because the truth is in immigration is that if you get the people before they come to your shores, the burden of proof is on them. Once they're inside your territory, the burden of proof is on you that to deal with them and so on. So from a management perspective, you always want to deal with your issues, with issues as much as you can overseas. And so the Australians were trying to set up a process where they would deal with them elsewhere than Australia. And then if they were found to need protection, hopefully the countries would burden share and so on, as a way of stopping what we call asylum shopping.
Explain the concept of burden share, because it sounds kind of difficult if you're an outsider.
Burden sharing is a term that's used in the world of asylum for saying that no one country should be asked to share an undue portion of the issue that we're facing, and it particularly comes out of Europe. In the early 1990s, when the Germans had, what was it, about 400,000 asylum seekers a year, they eventually changed their legislation so they could deal with the issue. And so the talk was, this is not something that any one country should be asked to share. But of course, what really happens in the reality of realpolitik is that this is observed more in the breach than in the practice. It is something that academics talk about, that countries that have the burden talk about, but countries that don't have the burden like to very much, you know, let those Germans handle that, you know, they're rich, they can manage. But in the context of something like the resettlement countries will get together, and the Indochina thing, long before my time, but the Indochina thing was an example of burden sharing, saying Western countries agree that this is something that we all need to work at together. And finally, in burden sharing, the countries will say, with some justification, burden sharing it can be done in a number of ways. It can also be given strictly by finance. I think that's probably the Japanese argument, because they're huge donors. But do you think the Japanese are interested in immigration or in refugees? But they will give money, so, you know.
Gerry, I guess looking at the time that you spent, the many things that happened, and the sort of sense that you have, if you go back to where we started with the Mike Malloy story and the very beginning of thinking about enlarging, bringing the community in, and looking at building these very specific provisions around asylum and resettlement, what, by the time we got to, you know, your period in the late 90s and early 2000, what have we learned? What have we improved the system? Have we made it more complex? Had we built on the foundation that was there, or had we mucked it up?
Well, I think we've improved it, but it is a system that will defy clarity. It's the attempt to balance sovereign rights and international obligations with people who will use the one system to achieve what they want to achieve is going to be there. So it's always going to be difficult. It's a fact of life. I think there is less illusion now, or more realism, but still not enough in my opinion, about the reality of immigration. Is that people who want a better life, because that's what it's about. You know, they look at the differences between what we have and what they have, and they decide, I want some of that for me and for my children. That reality means that they will do what they can to achieve that objective. And if it's not legal, if there's no legal avenue, they will choose another avenue very often. And that's not because they're bad people, because that's what's open to them. Our job is to respond to that. what's interesting to me is, in Raf's time and in Mike's time, the ability of the NGO community to control the agenda was really great. In my time, the NGO influence and ability to control the media and media interest was much, much less. In Raf's time, if the NGOs decided, with the cooperation of friendly media, they could keep an issue going for a week, longer. In my time, it lasted a day. Therefore, just simply for ministers who are looking at the politics of this, a very real and legitimate concern, the NGOs no longer have the same influence as they once did. They still have influence, and they should have influence, but not to the same degree. And it's because of a greater maturity, because in a sense, the NGOs have cried wolf for too long. They have said, the world is going to fall in if you do this, if you do this, if you do this. Meantime, we go ahead and we do this and we do this. And it actually turns out pretty good for many, many, many people. And that we're not really the kind of the bad people that they portrayed. And when it comes down to a choice, I think, today, between an NGO making their usual kind of complaint and what an immigration officer says, I think the immigration officer is more likely to win today than he would have 2 decades ago. So I think it makes it easier. The kind of things that Jason Kenney is doing, which again, this balance, this attempt to balance, couldn't be done when the last Conservative majority government was in place, because the feeling was, because the understanding of the issues wasn't as sophisticated as it is today. And because the political consequences were seen as more negative yesterday than they are today.
Looking at your career just really briefly, what was the highlight?
It's really hard to say, but this business is about people and what you can do with people. And I think in the old days, I remember deciding at one time, I don't know if this is a highlight or not, but it's a moment I'm happy with. Deciding at one time that after 4 years, after the Iranian Revolution, and all the Iranian students still in Canada would all demonstrated against the Shah, but now feared going back, that it was time to regularize their status. And I put the paper together, and I was a middle-level officer at this time, put the paper together. It went all the way up the line and was approved lickety-split. And you could do things like that in those days, and it worked. When I tried to do it years later with some of the Somalis, no way. There was too much fear, too much concern, and so on. So it was that ability to do things that actually make a difference for people. And the ability, and working in a way to protect refugees, as I said to a member of the European Parliament, we protect refugees, and we have such a good reputation for refugees and for immigrants because of one reason, because we take enforcement seriously. Coming to our country, we make choices, and when we say no, it means no, which gives the yeses a much greater validity than in other countries where you just cross the border and you stay. And you wonder why people...
Let's close it there. That's a good place to close it.
Thank you.
Gerry, thank you so much. I really appreciate your sharing your experiences with us. So intense. So many things went on while you were Director of Refugees, Director General. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Martha.